I'd just like to welcome everybody who's logged on and joined us this evening. We're really excited. If you don't know me, I'm Willie Smith. I'm the co-artist in residence of the painting program, along with Martha Misko. And we are so excited to have Colleen Asper here with us tonight. We've been really looking forward to her visit. And I'm going to hand it over to our visiting artist DA, Brock, for an introduction.
Thank you, Willie. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for being here. I'm excited to introduce tonight our visiting artist and guest lecturer, Colleen Asper. Colleen is a painter, writer, and performer. She has had solo exhibitions at galleries that include 17 Essex in New York, New York, On Stella Rays in New York, New York, and Stephen Wolf Fine Arts in San Francisco, California. Her work has been included in numerous group exhibitions in the United States and abroad at institutions that include Art in General in New York, New York, the Drawing Center in New York, New York as well, the Queen's Museum in New York, New York, Kunstverein Langenhagen in Hanover, Germany, and Lucinge Museum, Mali Lucinge, Croatia. Her work has been reviewed in publications that include Art Forum, Art in America, Frieze, and the New York Times. She has also contributed to publications that include The Believer, Art in America, and the Brooklyn Rail. Colleen's paintings act like the mime that doubles the body through mimicry and, at other times, like the empty mirror that voids the body in vampire stories. With that being said, we are thrilled to have her here at Cranbrook. Thank you for being here again, Colleen, and now you can take it away.
Thank you, Brock, for that introduction, and Willie and Martha for inviting me. Very happy to be here, and to all the students who I got to meet today. It was really great to be in your studios and see the work. So I'm going to go into screen share. All right, so I'm going to start out showing a performance which is somewhat apart from my painting practice before kind of diving into the paintings and some of the performances that are more closely tethered to the painting work. But I feel like this performance in particular will allow me to bring up some kind of broad ideas that thread through the work and also help me sort of tiptoe up to painting. The performance is one that I did with Marika Kandelaki, who's a frequent collaborator of mine, and the performance took place on the Lilac, which is a steamship museum. And the performance is of Medea. If folks aren't familiar with Medea, I'll give like an extremely abbreviated sort of cliff notes of the story, or at least the points that are important for our performance. So in the kind of larger tale of Jason and the Argonauts, Jason arrives at Medea's homeland, and Medea helps him steal from her father the golden fleece. She then goes back to Greece, which is where Jason is from. They get married, have several children, and about a decade later, he decides to leave her for the king's daughter in a kind of political move. And in revenge, she murders her children. So, you know, probably if you're familiar with Medea as a cultural figure, you're familiar with that aspect of her, that she sort of notoriously murders her own children. Marika and I reduced the whole sort of narrative of Medea to just a conversation that was happening between the two of us, playing two different aspects of Medea, and the Greek chorus, which is represented in the performance as audio. So this is me playing Medea as she appears in the context of her homeland, where she's a kind of mystic. And then this is Marika playing Medea as she appears in the context of Greece as a kind of wife and a mother. And we were interested in the ways in which both of these sort of aspects of Medea is this sort of mystical figure as a kind of vessel for nature, and Medea as a sort of vessel for man and the patriarchal family, that both of these were sort of dead-end positions. And we were interested in playing out this sort of character of Medea together as a kind of split subject that was divided between these two equally sort of empty contexts in which she appeared. so the mechanics of how the costuming worked, you can see here that I'm actually under Marika. So this is me. And there's this hoop that connects our costumes. So maybe just going one back, that sort of hoop at the bottom of the costume allows us to flip back and forth between the two sort of versions of Medea. So this is one moment where you can kind of see the flipping. And as we got kind of nearer and nearer to the climax of the narrative, we flipped back and forth sort of more quickly between the two sort of versions of Medea, playing out this internal argument that she was having with herself. It's only at the very end, when she makes the decision to kill her children, that we both appear simultaneously on the stage. And something that, again, is maybe like a through line from this performance to other works is being really interested in the way in which the body relates to language, and even trying to reimagine on a physical level how the body produces speech. So, here, obviously, we're kind of playing out this idea of a internal monologue to be sort of split within oneself as like a literal kind of doubling of the self. So yeah, this is sort of the moment of us deciding to kill our children. And then we pull apart the two hoops that have been connecting our costumes, and there's this red fabric that unfurls. We were interested in the red fabric as a kind of way to represent the sort of unthinkable act of the narrative. And then we sort of disappear into the red fabric. We were really drawn to the character of Medea because she's been, of sort of heroines in Greek mythology, she's almost sort of untouchable, like a figure of sort of pure nihilism. Unlike, say, someone like Antigone, that there's been a lot of sort of feminist revisions and retellings of the story of Antigone. Medea is just sort of seen as like beyond the pale, too evil. But of course, like what from the perspective of the narrative is a gesture of total nihilism is also the kind of possibility or opening for another narrative or story. And that's sort of another thread that runs through definitely a lot of the work that I've done over the years with Marika, is thinking about what appears as a kind of voiding or negation from one perspective can sort of flip and become a kind of possibility in another. But how I'm connecting, this particular performance to some of the work more broadly is, through an interest in performance and in, again, how the body relates to language, how the body produces speech. But also, this particular image that I'm pausing on is an image that sort of made me laugh when I saw it amongst the performance documentation, because it's this moment where I've turned my body into a rectangle. And I recognized, after many years of a painting practice at this point, that on a certain level, there's something that operates in my work at the level of desire, which is something I think we don't talk about enough as artists, just like what we desire, and therefore, on some level, is not totally nameable to ourselves even, but what we sort of desire in the work. And I've recognized this sort of desire to like physically kind of slip into the rectangle. And for me, that's a sort of point of tension between painting and performance, is what does it mean not to like be represented, but actually to be the representation, to be the kind of the painting. So using that to talk about this this next body of paintings. So this is an oil painting on panel. The panel is exactly my height and width, so it's 5'6", 16 inches. I'm someone who's, way back when background is actually in dance. And when I moved into painting, it made a lot of sense for me to think about my body as a, not even so much as a subject in the painting, as a sort of means to make a painting. But I was really kind of thrown for a loop in the ways in which how we talk about the body in performance and how we talk about it in the context of painting and representation is so sort of fragmented and different. And so I wanted to think about a way in which I could make a painting, make a representation that also simultaneously was a performance, right? So thinking about taking this white panel and painting an image on it of my two white gloved hands holding the panel seemed to me a way that I could both present the painting, right? Physically sort of present it with my body. And then and that obviously being like a performative gesture. And then in doing so, also create a representation. So this was a sort of space in which I was thinking for some time. This is a painting that's exactly the width of my arm. And so thinking about making this painting again of my two gloved hands holding a square, in this instance, that's the same proportion as the support. Earlier in one of my crits today, I was talking with someone about the hand, and the gloves appeared in this work at this time as a way of sort of thinking about the relationship between my hand and performance. So there's a way that when we talk about painting within a performative context, we often talk about the sort of mark or indexing of the artist's body, right? Certainly like in gestural painting, that's the way we talk about the sort of the trace of the sort of live body that's left through the sign of them having physically been there through mark or gesture. And that's something I've never in my own work been interested in. I'm always interested in sort of like burying or kind of withholding the recognizable signs of how the painting was made. And so there's this way that, you know, I sometimes almost get this question that basically boils down to like, well, where are you in the work? And I was interested in, you know, using my own body, but totally concealing it, and thinking about the satin gloved hand as being the sort of performance that you might associate with, say, like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat, right? It has this sort of quality of theatricality. I had a friend, a really awesome artist, Benjamin Kress, say about this painting that it reminded him of, or made him think of, burlesque minimalism. And I really like that. So I started playing with just other ways of thinking about the rectangle and the hand and the proportion of the support. This is a painting that's 8.5 by 10, I believe, whatever like standard size A printer paper is. So I was just thinking about the paper held up to the sun and making a painting of the sun's inscribing writing on the paper with light. This is a kind of loose diptych to that other work. So same format, thinking about here a flashlight held up to the paper. And this one is really hard to photograph and sort of hard to understand looking at in reproduction. So I have a side view here just to get a little bit more of a sense of the physicality of it. Thinking more about different ways that I could physically manifest the rectangle. Here, thinking about light, and within the context of representational painting, we talk about light as that which like reveals the form, in this case, could reveal the body, but using it here as a means of redacting or obscuring the body. Started to play around with other ways of holding the rectangle. So here, letting my knees be the sort of part of the body that holds the rectangle. Those paintings were all very kind of emptied out for me, and it was exciting to work in that way, but I wanted to sort of see what it would be like if I took that same format, but tried to kind of fill it back up. So this is one of, again, a sort of loose diptych that I made where I'm making a painting of myself holding a mirror. So which sometimes sort of hits the viewer a little bit more slowly, but like a dead sort of giveaway, as you can see the reflection of the fingertips in the mirror. So, you know, again, thinking about the mirror, not unlike light as something that we kind of go to give us an image of ourselves, but here thinking about it as a form of redacting the body. And then playing with that same format, thinking about sort of interior and exterior, and here the mirror being held up to a brick wall. At this point, I wanted to kind of flip that schema that I had been working with, and instead of thinking about the rectangle as a, you know, as something that the body was kind of holding and presenting, and, you know, in presenting also in the context of the painting representing, I wanted to think about the rectangle holding the body. I almost always work with my own body, but this is one of Marika, who I did that performance of Medea with. Because she's someone I've worked with so consistently over the years, I felt really comfortable kind of working with her body. And for these paintings, they all began with a pose. And then I thought about how to create a geometry that I would paint onto a mat that would somehow be a kind of simplification of that pose. So yeah, thinking about the triangles here. And then also wanting in all of them, at least one edge of the mat to line up with one edge of the painting. You know, it's sort of one of those like illusionistic like no-nos to have an object in the image coincide with the support, because it immediately breaks the illusion. But that's something I've always been really interested in the work, is sort of setting up an illusion and then breaking it. And there's lots that I do to kind of manipulate the perspective, color, light, etc., to kind of increase that sense of both creating and then breaking an illusion. So for instance, in this painting, if we were looking at a body in this orientation at this perspective, the floor plane would be coming much more, you know, out at us. There would be a much greater foreshortening. But I actually, you know, kind of rolled the floor plane down in the image to think about creating this one sort of line from one sort of, you know, vertical white line that kind of runs through the painting. Like similarly in that first one that I was showing, you know, if we were above the body in this way, we wouldn't see the, you know, the sort of top of the body larger than the bottom of the body. So there's this sort of weird flipping of perspective, which of this, you know, in my experience, is not something that immediately reads to the viewer as like an explicit distortion, but my hope is that it operates in such a way that it, you know, creates a sense of something that's kind of uncomfortable or a little bit subtly off. Something I forget often to talk about in my artist talk is just like the mechanics of how I make the paintings and think about making the paintings. And there's this sort of space that I want the paintings to occupy that, you know, and I feel like this is my little, you know, boulder that I push up my hill, because I don't know if this is possible, but at any rate, there's this sort of space that I want the paintings to kind of exist in that's feels like not real space, but not, you know, but still illusionistic space, that feels like not photographic space, not painting space, but, you know, has some sort of relationship to the illusion inherent in them all. So at this point, I realized that I had stumbled my way into making a monochrome with that first white painting in particular, and then some others that I'm not showing that were totally monochromatic. I have this sort of funny way of like not only, but often encountering a subject through like accidentally like backing into it. So I didn't really set out wanting to think about the history of the monochrome, but at a certain point I realized that, you know, here I was. And so I started thinking about what it meant, not just to put the body into the monochrome, which is of course like a space that's totally antithetical to representation, but what I had to do to put my body into the monochrome, what I had to do to kind of slip into that space. In order to insert my body into the monochrome, I had to introduce space and I had to introduce time, right? All of a sudden, if you have a body sort of inserted into the space, there's the immediate presupposition of like a before and an after, right? And those all seem to me sort of ways of, you know, of kind of almost opening up the monochrome in a sort of very perverse way to sort of queer the monochrome. I encountered at this point a term that I first encountered through Fred Moten, but Fred Moten actually picks it up through Derrida, which is this idea of invagination, which literally just means when there's a space that through some kind of internal pocket is larger than the boundary of the space itself. So I started to think about this idea of like invaginating the monochrome, again, like opening up that space. The colors of these paintings, oh, and I should pause and say, so these are 5 paintings. Again, each individual panel is my height and width, so same format as that first painting. And the colors are each just, you know, sort of discrete moments in a spectrum. There are lots of sort of color theory things. I was teaching color theory for the first time and got like really super geeked out on it when I was making this painting. So there are lots of sort of color theory things that I was playing with. But I was also interested in, I was reading Goethe at the time and interested in the way he used the word spectrum, which was not to refer to a color spectrum, but was to refer to after image. You know, so if you were looking at, say, the purple panel for an amount of time and looked away and saw a yellow after image, and thinking about the sort of roots of the words spectrum are specter and spectator, and again thinking about this idea of, you know, of kind of haunting the monochrome in some way. And after image seemed a really great sort of perceptual way to talk about that. You know, to talk about what it means to come after something that is itself trying to picture a condition in which there is no time. Detail, obviously, you know, the sort of physical act of making these paintings and the kind of labor of painting is a huge part of what I do that gets lost to some degree in the reproduction. So this is a detail of that panel all the way on the left. This is a photo from a performance that I did with the artist Justin Lieberman. I'm not gonna, just for time's sake, I'm not gonna talk really too much about this performance, but I did wanna show it just to nod to the fact that this is the first, I'd been doing a lot of performance collaboratively, but this is the first time that I conceived of a performance for a show of paintings. And at least at this point, like, I can't imagine doing a show of paintings without the performance. It's become really important. I also, as Brock mentioned in reading my bio, I do a lot of writing. For many years, that meant writing art criticism. But then at a certain point, that sort of turned into writing a lot of fiction. And at this point, the fiction has become scripts for performances. So in this particular performance, I was thinking about, if the monochrome is in no space, then the body that would inhabit the monochrome would be a nobody. So the show is called Monobody Nobody, and I wrote this script where I played the character Nobody and Justin played the character Monobody. And then the other reason I wanted to show an image of this performance without getting too much into it was just to say that there was a line that I wrote in the script that is, structured like a stage set apart by curtains or a vagina framed by labia, representation is always already performative. And when I wrote that line, I like instantly pictured the next sort of body of work, which is this. And like, as instantly as I pictured it, I was like, oh no, like I can't make that. And that feeling of like, you know, of sort of embarrassment around one's own sort of ideas or the kind of direction of the work is one I try to be attentive to and to follow. So I started making these paintings. All of the paintings that I've shown thus far have been oil paintings. This painting is a watercolor, and the next several paintings that I'm going to show are watercolors. You know, when I had that sort of oh no moment, you know, part of what was behind that sort of oh no was thinking about all of the ways in which the vagina has sort of been represented historically and contemporarily, right? So, and how all of those sort of modes that we would encounter the vagina as an image are so overwrought in the symbolic or overdetermined within the symbolic, right? So, you know, within the context of pornography, it would appear as a spectacle. Within the context of psychoanalysis, it appears as, you know, like the absence of a penis. Within the context of the, you know, big air quotes here, like the, you know, biological sciences, in some deeply problematic version of that, it would appear as a sort of sign of a female body, which I totally and completely reject. in the context of art history, a lot of really canonical feminist work that uses the vagina is both work that's very, important for me and work that I've been deeply influenced by and informed by, but also work that makes me deeply uncomfortable insofar as it also seems to take the vagina as a sort of sign for a female body in a deeply essentialist way. So I wanted to see if I could somehow, after at this point, many decades of working with my body in the context of performance, in the context of painting, if there was some way I could paint this part of my body and not have it sort of fall into any of those very kind of overdetermined symbolic registers. I started making these as watercolors for a few reasons. One of them was just mechanical. Like I knew that there were things that I wanted to try out sculpturally, I suppose, or materially. So this is silver mylar, just with a marker making an X. And there's just something about the flatness of paper that seemed like it made sense with those kind of sculptural interventions in a way that the panel didn't. I was also really interested in thinking about these as signs and therefore paper having this relationship to the sign. Started playing around with different proportions of the rectangle. It feels particularly strange to say this when I'm speaking into a kind of void where I can't see you all, because this is like possibly too much information from your visiting artist. But I like to see things and actually, physically sort of experience them. So I ended up like on all these sort of DIY make your own dildo websites and figured out how to, with silicone, actually make a rectangular insert so I could actually physically see what was happening when I stuck a rectangle into my vagina. So playing around with different proportions, again, is a way of thinking about taking this form, this part of my body, and this idea of using it to hold the rectangle, to hold the sort of space of painting, and to play with that in all sorts of ways that would hopefully defamiliarize it. Language felt really appropriate right away. Something about the sort of the way the vagina that I was first thinking about as a kind of stage, right? Again, this idea of the labia as kind of curtains also obviously makes lips that have a relationship to the mouth. And yet, historically, all of the ways in which the vagina has been sort of rendered mute, it seemed really appropriate and funny to place language there. The more I started playing with language, the more I started thinking about how I could, in hanging them, almost use them as a kind of language. So just flipping back, for example, like this one, it was not the first I made, but I actually made it when I was like, okay, if I have these different parts of a sentence that I could sort of use to write with on the wall, I need a protagonist, right? And I was thinking about how many jokes sort of begin with like somebody, like somebody walked into a bar, or somebody did this. And that this could be a sort of generic character that could take on the role of different specific characters as I needed it to in different contexts. This is a watercolor with a curtain physically sewn into the paper. So at this point, some of the physical sort of, collaging and additive parts of the paintings, I was thinking of within the context of performance. So I knew I was going to do a show and there was going to be a performance. And so I was thinking about things that I could physically manipulate for that performance. So the curtain opens and closes. I was interested in that, like it seemed funny to me to make like a kind of skirt for my vagina that I could then sort of open and close. Part of that process of defamiliarization, I mean, it certainly happened for me within the context of making these paintings. After making a few of them, the vagina became a form, right, that I was thinking about within a kind of painting context. And I was hoping for the viewer, there would be a kind of repetition that would make it so in a certain way, the vagina becomes a frame, right? And then what's inside the vagina is actually the quote unquote painting. Well, at the same time, that could never be the case because obviously the vagina is going to be like the loudest part of the image. This is the rectangle here is actually clear mylar that I've spray painted. So it appears potentially as opaque because you're seeing the white of the wall behind the part that doesn't have spray paint on it. But then in the context of the performance, I could put things behind that space and almost turn it into like a sort of, you know, space of like a shadow puppet show. Another one, again, this is one painting with this sort of staircase that I was making, knowing that the staircase would play a role in the performance. And this is just what it looks like when it's closed and what it looks like when it's open. Okay, so I'm gonna show about like a 5-minute clip from documentation from the performance I did. The performance itself, though, is a half an hour, so you're just getting a little sliver of it. And so I need to tell you a few things so you can sort of make sense of what you're seeing. So this is a performance that I did, again, with Marika Kandelaki. So she and I are the two characters that appear in these sort of happy, sad costumes. We were thinking, again, about the Greek chorus and also comedy tragedy masks. The two other performers are Bronwyn Rowe and Ted Mineo. And I wrote a narrative that, you know, it's a pretty traditional short story in terms of its structure. You know, it has a linear sort of trajectory from beginning to end. And Ted and Bronwyn read the story. And I gave them really like one main instruction, which was to, you know, to just read the story in a very straight way and pretend that they couldn't see Marika and myself in these costumes. Marika and I do the job, and our sort of role as like Greek chorus of connecting what the what's happening in the story to the paintings. So we're the ones that physically manipulate the paintings. We also seem to know things before the characters themselves do. So we have this sort of mischievous kind of all-knowing sort of clownish presence. There's also, in the clip that I'm going to show you, one moment where I sort of become one of the characters in the story. So occasionally when the two main characters have to interact with someone else, we kind of take on that role. The story itself is based on Bluebeard, which is loosely based on Bluebeard. Like, no one who saw the performance or read the story would think about Bluebeard at all. This was only sort of in my own mind, but Bluebeard is a French folktale that, again, probably some of you are familiar with, but I have to give a lot of, because there's so much narrative in my work, I have to give a lot of like cliff note narratives. So in Bluebeard, basically there's this wealthy man who has many dead wives and marries this young woman and agrees, gives her keys to every room in the castle and says that she has total access to all of them except for one. There's one room she can't enter. And then he leaves, and of course she inevitably transgresses that prohibition and enters the room that she shouldn't. And when she does so, she finds what she knew on a certain level, or what we knew anyway, on a certain level would be there all along, which is the dead bodies of all of his ex-wives. This story has always seemed to me like an incredibly obvious metaphor for the unconscious, right? Like, there's one room in the house that you can't go into. When you do go into it, you know, what you sort of feared and knew would be there manifests itself. So in my version, it's set roughly in the present. There's a couple, for plausibility's sake, the man has only one dead wife. They're at the man whose name is Thomas. They're at Thomas's aunt's house. His aunt is away. They're there. It's somewhat remote. She's supposed to be working on a dissertation. He's working on a book. Their relationship sort of slowly unravels. And that's a lot of the narrative follows the sort of slow unravel of their relationship. Meanwhile, the protagonist, the female protagonist, who's unnamed in the story as a sort of nod to Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, the female protagonist, who we very much follow through the story, her clit starts to swell. This first happens after sex. It's not immediately something that takes on a kind of surreal or fantastic aspect in the narrative, but as it begins to like preoccupy more and more of her mental space, it clearly becomes sort of a fantastic element. Eventually, you know, very end of the story, she finds a key in Thomas's desk that opens up her clitoris. She enters into a stairway, sort of appears. She goes into the stairs, and she finds not just his dead wife, but also all these other women who she knows primarily through him having told her about them. And I was interested in, you know, the unconscious being actually like physically in her own body, right? The sort of room that she can't go into being in her own body. And also thinking about emotional labor and what it means to sort of hold in your own body the stories that someone else tells about people that sort of comprise their life story. So anyway, I know that's a mouthful, but hopefully it'll make this clip somewhat legible.
When the gynecologist finally saw me, she was a short, round woman who looked like a lunch lady. She listened to me describe my inexplicable ailment with a gently cocked head. And after a few questions delivered, in a cheerful voice suggested,
"Will you take a look and see what's going on down there?"
I slid my feet into the stirrups and stared up at the dropped ceiling. She parted my pink gown, and I imagined her with a wooden spoon in hand, intent on stirring me like a vat of mac and cheese.
Well, it's definitely enlarged. I think I see a hair under the clitoral hood. Perhaps that's the irritant? Do you shave? Oh no, I can see you don't shave. Okay, I'm going to remove the hair.
I was mute as she pulled tweezers wrapped in plastic from a drawer. She disappeared between my legs again. I felt first a painful tug, and then it was as if she was pulling a vein out of my body. I screamed.
Okay, that's over now. It looks like this was growing there really most unusual. There are no hair glands in the clitoris.
She brought the tweezers to meet my gaze, and I saw a hair dangling from them I would never recognize as my own. It was pale and reddish, as if a piece of my dark body hair had sat too long in bleach.
So now we need to get the swelling down. The best thing to do for that is to take a nice hot bath. At least 3 times a day for 20 to 30 minutes. That'll take care of the inflammation, and then you'll come back and see me in a week.
I felt like I had startled, even disturbed my artless gynecologist with an illegible body. My first improbable thought was that Aunt Joan had come home. Seeing several books stacked on the floor made me realize the obvious, that it was Thomas who had been in the bed. As I approached the door to the office, Thomas stiffened, then quickly dropped something into the small drawer at the back of the desk. He slid the drawer closed softly as he turned to face me.
You startled me.
Did I? I guess I haven't been back here in a while.
Are you going somewhere? You're dressed like you're going somewhere.
Going somewhere?
So the gynecologist?
No, I got dressed to come see you. At this, I crossed into the office and Thomas stood up. We both stared at each other in silence, and then he leaned in as if to kiss me. The phone rang and I started, not even realizing that there was a phone in the office.
Shit, I have to take that. I think it's the publisher.
He picked up the phone.
Hey, Steve?
I walked back out of the bedroom. I thought about sitting on the bed, but despite the rumpled sheets, it felt intrusive. So I sat on the floor and paged through one of the books. Thomas's talk was brief, but clearly involved plans to meet. He hung up and stood in the doorway. Sounds like you're the one going somewhere now.
Steve's in Cornwall visiting his wife's family. He wasn't sure if he'd be able to get away, but his wife's seeing an old friend tonight, so we're going to meet for dinner.
Tonight?
Yeah, short notice, I know, but this is great timing. I'm on track to finish the book ahead of schedule, and I can talk to him about starting promotion now. You'll be okay here without me, just this one night, right?
Screw.
disappear into a hole. The hole didn't want to be filled by a screw. Our protagonist was wrapped in beautiful mirrored cloth that showed Thomas whole and straight.
The hole has a hole full of rotting meat. Our protagonist washed her cloth, despite the dry clean only label. It shrunk, revealing a fin. Our protagonist became large enough that the screw could fall right through her.
Despite its elegant appearance, the clawfoot tub always feels a little grimy.
Okay, hopefully that made sense. I know video and Zoom sometimes can be not friends. So anyway, if anyone has questions about what's going on in there, I can certainly talk about that in the Q&A. Okay, so the next grouping of paintings and performance that I want to talk about is a show I did in this, I guess, the summer before quarantine. So, you know, at this point, I had been working with painting and performance and wanted to figure out a way to kind of disrupt what is the sort of traditional like physical relationship between those two forms, which is one in which the performance happens in front of the paintings and the paintings become a kind of stage set for the performance. And I wanted to see if there was a way I could actualize that initial idea I had about the vagina as a kind of theater. And so I made these 3 paintings that hung on 3 freestanding walls and had a kind of hole that I performed through each of them. The show was called Arms, Legs, and Fingers, and the first performance I'm performing with my arms. The story here is this sort of elementary school age girl whose name is Rosalind, and her relationship with her friend's mother is sort of the one of the things that's explored in the narrative. So she has these 3 friends, they're all brothers, and she has this very tense relationship with their mother. One of the ways that first manifests itself in the story is the mom calls her Rose, and she sort of bristles against this like diminutive nickname. She's really repulsed by the mother's mouth, and there's a lot of very physical descriptions of the mouth and how the mouth moves. And so in this part of the performance, I'm using my hands to kind of play the mother's mouth. And I was interested in, you know, throughout all of this sort of performance that happens in 3 acts, there are different ways I'm sort of using parts of my body to appear as parts of other bodies or as discrete bodies. There's sometimes a very loose relationship between the narrative and the props that I'm using, and sometimes a very pointed one. So in this instance, she's describing the youngest brother as like an egg, only really steady when you rest him on his bottom. The 3 brothers, though, are also represented by different colored handkerchiefs, you know, so that is something that isn't an image that appears in the text, but is one that appears in the context of the performance. So this is the middle brother, this is the oldest brother. This is a moment where she's playing with all 3 brothers, and so yeah, there's this sort of rope that gets made of the handkerchiefs that move sort of in and out of the vagina or the stage. The sort of climatic scene of this particular narrative is she's playing on the slip and slide with the 3 brothers. So the yellow gloves here make an appearance as the slip and slide. And all 3 of them are topless. They're all little kids. And the mom pulls her aside and basically like shames her for not wearing a shirt because she's a girl. And she later on goes, so she sort of leaves and is embarrassed, and later on sort of goes back to the yard when the mom is asleep or taking a nap in a chair adjacent to the slip and slide. And there's this whole sort of scene that plays out between her and the mom. And in that scene in particular, I have her as she's sort of playing on the slip and slide by herself. inadvertently kind of pantomime some of the gestures of the mom's mouth that appeared early in their performance. And I was really interested in how gender is sort of something that's inscribed on the body through imitation. And even when that imitation happens as a form of parody, the way in which it's still internalized in the body. So that's something I was thinking about in the narrative. The next performance is with my legs, and that is the shortest of the three sort of acts in the performance. So I'm going to show a video of that in its entirety. One long wall of the yoga studio was made up of a row of 4 by 8 foot mirrors, crossbar by lay bar. The other, a sprawling storage rack made out of PVC tubes. Several of the tubes had slipped from their joiners, skewing the rack and leaving exercise balls rolling along the floor. The yoga teacher paced in front of the class, her reflection moving across each of her students in the mirror. In plank pose, roll your shoulders back and tilt your pelvic bowl forward to take the curve out of the small of your back. You should be in one straight line from the crown of your head to your heel. Now the only thing that's going to move is your arms as you lower halfway down. Not yet. Not yet. Stay in plank pose. I want you to imagine your favorite animal. Lily pictured a unicorn. She didn't have any particular connection to unicorns. She didn't have an affinity with any animals, really. That was what prompted her to choose an imaginary one. It wasn't the unicorn's positive attributes that attracted her, innocence or untamed magic, but rather its most glaring negative quality. It isn't. This animal is underneath your torso. Now as you lower from plank pose into vinyasa, try not to crush your favorite animal. Lily bent her arms. The tiny unicorn waited expectantly underneath her torso. The last year of elementary school, Lily's best friend moved away, and she spent all of her time with Jamie, a neighborhood girl who was a year older. Jamie was not as smart as Lily, but she was already in middle school and looked for every opportunity to test Lily. Sometimes Jamie's tests were obvious. When Lily was following her up the steps of the basement, Jamie abruptly stopped and blocked her way. "What's 5 times 23? She said. 115. "What's 13 times 12? Lily answered each time as quickly as she could, and when she didn't know the answer, she made it up. That Lily might lie seemed never to have occurred to Jamie, who was first annoyed and then amazed at her friend's ability to do multiplication in her head. Forgetting that her questions had been intended to humiliate Lily, Jamie went off to get her mom to show off Lily's trick. Jamie's mom seemed also not to notice when Lily made up an answer. Other times, the tests were more ambiguous. Neither girl was allowed to walk to the park without an adult, but after Jamie turned 12, she thought her parents would change their mind, and one day she told Lily to wait on the front lawn while she asked. When Jamie came out, she asked Lily to guess what her parents had said. Lily couldn't read her friend's expression. First she guessed no, then yes, then no again, as Jamie remained inscrutable. She told Lily they had said yes, but that they couldn't leave just yet. Then she admitted they had said no, before trying again to convince Lily they had said yes. The afternoon light began to fade, and Lily knew they couldn't go to the park now, but still Jamie insisted they would. Lily felt foolish for ever having believed her. Jamie was developing breasts and spent so much time looking through bras in a JCPenney's catalog that her mom began to make jokes about it. She talked about boys at school and wanted to practice with Lily for when they had boyfriends. She tried to make Lily pretend to be the boy, but Lily didn't know how, and finally Jamie grew impatient and said she would be the boy. They were in Jamie's parents' room with the drapes closed. The sunlight made bright pink shapes when it showed through the heavy tan fabric, but the light exhausted itself there, leaving the rest of the room dim and dusty. Jamie took Lily's shirt off in the big adult bed. She ran her hand along Lily's chest. "It's so flat," she said. Lily didn't know what to say. Jamie was quiet for a while, then seemed to come to a solution that satisfied her. "I'm a serial killer and I cut off your breasts in a fit of passion." She put her hand over Lily's mouth and began to kiss the back of her hand. Lily felt a warm throbbing where her breasts had been. At first this was exciting, and she wished Jamie would touch her chest again. Then she began to feel that the hand over her mouth was smothering her and wished Jamie would move. Not only could she not feel Jamie's lips, soon she couldn't feel her own. And she imagined Jamie's hand sinking into her head without resistance, landing on the pillow underneath, and severing her spinal column. "As you lower, keep your chin slightly tucked to keep the back of your neck long," said the yoga teacher. Lily lowered herself until her elbows grazed her ribs. Suddenly, she was pierced through the chest by the unicorn's horn. Its point seemed to drive a knot into her very core. Her shoulder blades released from her back, letting her arms slide out and roll along the floor with the exercise balls. The weight of her torso dropping seemed to loosen her legs. Now the space between her pelvis and thighs was infinite, swallowing the whole room. Her head shattered, and everything went black. Only the unicorn remained, prancing through the vast space of the unknown. So I'll just say, to connect that part of the performance to what preceded it, is that each of the three performances within the main performance are discrete figures with different names and so on. But I was thinking about a kind of through line running between them. So in this one, the age of the girls is, sort of pre-adolescent. In the previous one, elementary school. So I was thinking about the whole thing as a kind of coming of age story. Yeah, also, of course, interested again in like what it meant to take my legs and turn them into like two discrete actors in a performance. The third sort of act in the performance was with my fingers. So in this one, I'm using, again, the different colored gloves to sort of signify different moments in the text and key into different things that were happening. This performance begins, or the text that this performance is a reading of begins with two freshmen on spring break, so continuing that sort of trajectory of the ages, and then sort of slips into a first person voice that's clearly me and clearly the present. And so it sort of becomes the most essayistic of the three texts. And I end up talking about things that are happening in the world at that moment. I talk about science fiction, super interested in science fiction, even though I think my work would not be confused with science fiction. I am really interested interested in science fiction for the ways in which it does something that I try and do in my work too, which is reimagine the body. Yeah, and there's a lot that's the longest part of the performance. It's probably about 15 minutes. So there's a lot happening in that text, but a through line is I'm trying to think about naming and this, how one acquires a name and what it means to be called a name. And yeah, part of, again, this sort of coming of age story. This is a side view. So the three walls that were built out for the paintings are, very easy to sort of see around. And, I'm showing you shots from the front, but when I was performing in the context of the show, there were as many people or more people even that were seeing me from the side or from 3/4, etc. And I like that way in which the sort of man behind the curtain is totally visible, right? So you can see even though I'm backstage, I'm very much physically present. Okay, so I'm going to end by talking about what I'm sort of in the middle of right now. So I'm going to sort of get into process a little bit more. I'm going to show a few drawings, and these are like drawings that I make just trying to sort of figure things out for myself and not necessarily the sort of thing I would show. These are like sketchbook drawings. But right now I'm working with a text that I don't know where it's going to go, but I assume it'll at the end be some kind of narrative that will play out in some performance. And I'm right now very interested in the character of Echo from Echo and Narcissus. I'm also thinking about the ear, and I'll show a little bit more of that in a moment. But thinking about hearing and Echo. So Echo and Narcissus is a story in Metamorphosis by Ovid, and we're probably all very familiar with Narcissus as a sort of cultural figure. Narcissus becomes very important for Freud, so Narcissus plays a sort of role in the foundations of psychoanalysis. Narcissus becomes a very important figure for queer theory. A lot of queer theorists have sort of written about Narcissus. Narcissus is just like a cultural figure, right? Like we talk all the time about narcissism. So we're all pretty familiar with that character, but the original sort of Narcissus in Metamorphosis appears in a story called Echo and Narcissus. And Echo is a very loquacious figure. Different sort of translations put an emphasis on her as either sort of like a gossip, someone who just like talks a lot and gossips, or in some of them I like to think of her as almost a kind of sophist, where she's the sort of philosopher who weaves truths through her speech. And but at any rate, she distracts Hera, who's Zeus's partner, when Zeus is having an affair on her. And so in punishment, Hera curses her to only be able to repeat the last thing that someone says. And very interested in Echo as, there's a lot I'm interested in with Echo, but one of the things is just thinking of Echo as a sort of metaphor for all of our relationship to language, right? Like language is something that's sort of given to us. We learn through repetition. We have no sort of possibilities other than to repeat. And yet somehow we have to create agency through that relationship that we have to repetition and language. In this one, I'm thinking about, and I should say, so then Echo goes on to fall in love with Narcissus. So that's when Narcissus emerges in the story. The texts here are all texts that are either things that Narcissus says in Metamorphosis in the story, or things that are sort of ascribed to him. And there's this really amazing scene where, Echo's trying to express her love of Narcissus, but of course she can only repeat Narcissus. And Ovid sort of plays with setting up Narcissus's lines such that by only repeating the last few words, Echo is still able to express herself. And then at the end of this sort of dialogue between them, she has to sort of cruelly reject herself. So interested in that scene and the sort of breaking down between speech and hearing. This one I was just thinking about myth and the relationship myth has to narrative. Like so much of especially Greek mythology is a sort of form of storytelling in which, like, from the beginning, what's going to happen, right? Like, the moment you read about Oedipus, that he is fucking his mother, right? There's not like a spoiler there. So the whole sort of story becomes about the sort of anticipation at arriving at a moment in the narrative that's like foretold from the beginning. So thinking about the difference between like narrative and prophecy. This is like me trying to think about the inner ear, the different chambers of the cochlea. The two texts that are sort of woven through here is that final text, the final dialogue between Echo and Narcissus, where Narcissus is saying, "Don't cling to me, I'd sooner die than say I'm yours." And Echo is just saying, "I'm yours, I'm yours." So thinking a lot about, hearing as historically having been seen as a sort of passive way to relate to language, but all of the ways that hearing can actually be a sort of source of agency. So thinking about the ear, I made a cast of my ear. And the reason I did this is because knowing I wanted to insert something into the ear, it turns out the ear is an orifice that does not hold a rectangle. So I started to actually get really interested in the shape of the ear, and it seems to me a really kind of very abstract part of the body, right? The sort of function of hearing isn't immediately apprehendable in the shape of the ear. So this is, I cast my ear, and then I cast the sort of space of inside of my ear. So that's what that space looks like. And then that's been a sort of jumping off point for a series of paintings. I'm just going to show this one. So this is, a painting with a hole cut out that you're seeing my mouth and nose through. This is a performance that I did on Zoom, my first and I hope only Zoom performance. But yeah, nevertheless, a Zoom performance I did where, again, I'm thinking about this relationship between the mouth and the ear. And the text that I wrote for this is, very sort of specific to the moment in which I did this performance, and has to do with thinking about painting and its relationship to place and portability. But, more broadly with this work, thinking about, again, the sound, part of what the story of Echo and Narcissus does is, and the reason why, we know Narcissus is a kind of cultural figure, is because Narcissus is bound up with sight, and we live in a very ocular-centric culture. So thinking about the auditory, and I had this one day with a close friend of mine where, like, all day long I kept, for some reason, like, mishearing him. And what I would mishear him saying was something like way more sort of sexual and sort of strange than what he had actually said. And at the end of that day, he was like, God, you have such like a Freudian ear. So, again, thinking about the way we make meaning sort of on the end of hearing and not just speech. And so that is the end. That's the last image that I have for you all. I'm going to jump out of share. And yeah, thanks for sitting with me for an hour through that.
Thank you so much. Do you mind taking a little time to take some questions?
Yeah, not at all. Happy to answer questions.
So if people have questions, can they type them into the Q&A, I think?
I can field this one from Ian McLaughlin. You talked a lot about classical mythology in your work and mentioned science fiction too. Curious, what's your favorite, most influential science fiction piece?
Everything that Octavia Butler has ever written indiscriminately. So that last performance, or I guess the second to last performance that I showed, the one with the fingers, I talk about Octavia Butler's Exogenesis trilogy, which I'm like, you probably don't want to hear me paraphrase another narrative, so I'm not going to paraphrase it, but I will just say it's based on this alien species that has to mate with other species in order to survive. And so really interested in the way in which that is a metaphor, seemingly to me, for the way in which like difference is necessary to survival, which, is one of the really profound sort of ideas that threads through Octavia Butler. So yeah, I love a lot of science fiction, but Octavia Butler would definitely be a favorite.
There's a question from Clara Nolte. Can you talk about your relationship to Greek mythology? Are there other mythologies you're engaged with as well?
Yeah, so like Bluebeard, for example, is like a French folktale that I think dates back to the 15th century, so not Greek mythology, but Medea and Echo are. At this point I've actually done 3 performances that were sort of retellings of Greek myth. One of them I did with a bunch of other people and I didn't show. Definitely not something I set out to do, like I'm gonna retell Greek mythology. So I arrived at the 2 that I showed you in very different ways. Marika and I arrived at Medea through, at that point we had sort of come across, I mentioned this briefly, that there's been like a lot of sort of feminist takes on Antigone. We had sort of come across a lot of retellings of Antigone or analysis of Antigone, and that we were interested in. But it seemed like Antigone was like a very limited sort of feminist character. So, you know, Antigone sort of defies the state to bury the remains of her brother. That's my super abbreviated version of Antigone. So there's a way that she sort of like defies one order, but only to kind of uphold another. She sort of like defies the state to uphold the family, where like Medea like literally destroys the family. You know, she's just a much more extreme character. So our interest in Medea actually kind of arrived at Anne Carson, Judith Butler, you know, just like encountering a lot of sort of takes on Antigone. And then Echo and you know, I was reading with, you know, a friend, I was reading Ovid's Metamorphosis and just sort of got really interested in the character of Echo. So that's how I arrived at that. But other mythologies, I'm, you know, again, like Bluebeard would be French, sort of 15th century French folktale, science fiction, Octavia Butler. But I think, you know, my attraction to Greek mythology has to do with the ways in which, you know, and I think I'm not alone here, the ways in which sort of ideas about gender, sexuality, time, religion, death, like all these things are really irreverent, you know, sort of notoriously irreverent in Greek mythology. So I think that's where my attraction to those narratives come from. There's a way that you can really sort of get at certain kind of cultural mechanisms behind how meaning has been sort of constructed in the West through Greek mythology, because it is so sort of bare and obvious in a way.
There's a question from Isabel. Do you view the work as self-portraiture?
Oh, that's a great question. This is yes and no. I mean, so when I was talking earlier about having come from this dance background, you know, as a dancer, your medium in a very real way is your body, right? But it doesn't follow from that there's the assumption that your dance or your sort of use of your body is self-expressive or autobiographical. I mean, I can think of like Yvonne Rainer, you know, certain instances in which dancers have made work that's autobiographical or self-expressive, but that's not the sort of default. So when I first started painting and working with my body, I was really sort of taken for a loop with the ways in which there was this sort of default reading of either, you know, autobiography or sort of self-expression. And it just like didn't even make sense to me with my sort of background and training. And for, you know, I would say many years, the sort of primary motivation in the work was to then make a self-portrait that couldn't possibly be read as self-expressive or autobiographical. It was like a purely negative impulse, which I think is not uncommon and not even bad, right? That like a lot of how artists or just anybody like makes work is by being like, oh my God, like I don't want to do this. Like, I don't want to do this. Like, this is terrible, you know, and then maybe there's like something left like right in here that can be the work. So yeah, like for, you know, predating the work I showed, there was a lot of work that I sort of thought of as a kind of a way to work with my body that was a kind of anti-self-portrait. I mean, of course, though, you know, when you're sort of setting yourself up against something, you're also speaking to that history too. So I think that lingers in the work. So yeah, yes and no.
Do you mind taking a couple more questions?
Not at all. Okay. I'm happy to.
So Sylvan says, hi, Colleen. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I'm interested in the different ways you've engaged painting formats such as theater, mirrors, and film. How do you think about the ways these formats might change how people engage with the work as audience or viewer or spectator?
It's a great question. It's a really, really good question. So, okay, I'm thinking about, I'm gonna maybe dilly-dally in speaking while I think through the answer to that question, because I think there's a lot there. But it makes me think about, so I had this epiphany recently. I was, but in order to explain the epiphany, I need to say, so some years ago, I was doing crits with Josephine Haverson, who's an awesome painter, some of you all might know. And I remember someone, I can't remember what we were looking at, but someone brought up that this particular painting that we were looking at was like cinematic. And Josephine was like, why is it? And everyone was like, or, you know, the artist was like, thank you, you know. And Josephine was like, why is it then like when anyone compares painting to like anything else, like it's like a compliment to the painter or something? Like is painting so insecure that like if it's like something else, it's like automatically a compliment? So anyway, it was a funny moment in Crit that sort of always stuck with me. And recently I was watching a movie, oh my God, the Grand Budapest Hotel, right? Which if anyone's seen that, it's like there are sort of quotations to painting throughout. And that's, you know, we can think about like a lot of films that are like that like try to look like graphic novels or try to look like paintings or try and look like drawing or, you know, whatever, try and look like some sort of or try and look like photography. And so I was like, wait a second, it's not just like painting that's so insecure that it's like, you know, sort of is complemented by taking on a relationship to any form. Like sort of every form does that, right? Like every form sort of plays with visually borrowing from the history of the other form. And I think it's just a sort of fundamental kind of pleasure that actually has to do with illusion, right? That like there's something pleasurable about seeing a painting that acts like a not painting or a film that acts like a painting or, you know, etc. So yeah, I think part of that is just like an extension of my interest in kind of illusion and how illusion works. You know, there are very specific things, because I think your question was really specific, so I want to answer in a specific way. Like there are really specific things that happen that I like though. Like in that last sort of like Zoom performance that I showed, you know, I made a painting to cradle my nose such that like a little bit of the painting like goes up my nose, right, in the context of the performance. And there's something about the sort of, you know, we all as painters have deeply physical relationships with our paintings, but then there's a way in which they're presented that, you know, they can't be touched, and they, you know, I don't know if probably some of you have had this experience where you're like talking to someone about your work and you like go to like brush some dust off it or something, and the person's like, oh, you know, you touched it. It's like, of course I touched it, I made it. So I'm interested in the ways in which like treating painting as like a prop or a set can also be like a form of sort of like defiling painting. And yeah, that's been really generative for me. Like for me, you know, I feel like I have my most, I don't know, sort of complicated or interesting or surprising thoughts about painting when I'm writing, or language when I'm painting, and so on. So there's something about sort of moving outside of one way of working and slithering into another that's really generative.
We have one more question here in the box. It's from Sam. Your work reminds me a bit of the video and performance works of Mary Reed Kelly. Are you familiar with her work?
I am, yeah, she's awesome. I'll take that as a compliment. Yeah, I mean, she's a great example of what I was just talking about, right? I mean, she's a visual artist, but you know, obviously, and she, you know, her background is in painting, and obviously painting is the sort of frame through which she engages performance and through which she engages video. And like, I would argue, you know, 90% of the pleasure in her work is the ways in which she sort of cracks open one medium through another.
Well, thank you so much. That was such a fantastic talk. And I think I'd like to see an essay entitled "The Ear is an Orifice That Does Not Hold a Rectangle." Thank you so much.
I'm working on it right now.
So thank you everybody for coming out, and thank you, Colleen.
Yeah, thanks everyone for the questions. They were really great, and it was such a pleasure to meet many of you, and hope to be together in person someday.
Definitely.
So much.
Okay, bye. Take care, everyone.
You all.